What is poverty? Is it easy to define, or is it a complex matter influenced by different factors? How do EU statistics deal with this complexity? How do we quantify poverty?
Hi Lucy!
Hi Marta.
So how are you settling back in?
Fine, yes. It's nice to be home. I'm still getting used to the affluence here. Having just come back from a poorer region, that's what strikes me the most.
You know, as a journalist, I'm always on the hunt for a good story. Actually, just recently I came across a documentary showing how in statistics, poverty in the EU is sometimes treated in relative terms. There was an example on income which discussed how a person on a low income compares to a middle income earner in their country. And then I started to think about other examples where problems of poverty become a question of perspective. One factor affecting poverty is the way national income is distributed across individuals and households. Here, have a look at some statistics.
If we take the EU average, 20% of highest income earners have 39% of the total income, while 20% of lowest income earners have only 8%. But at a local level, income distribution among EU member states differs greatly. For example, low-income earners in the Czech Republic have 10% of the total national income, and this gives the country relatively more income equality for this group of people than Spain, for example, where the percentage is just 6%. Another country with relatively more income equality is Sweden, where high earners have just 34% of the total income, while in Lithuania, people with high earnings get a considerably higher amount, 44% of the national income.
So the way national income is distributed varies from country to country, which affects poverty levels. And maybe people's perception also varies between different countries, regions, cities and villages.
I think you could be right. I'm going to interview some of the EU public to find out.
Definitely think there is no poverty in Prague and everything's bright and people getting the jobs, and I think everything's fine.
To be honest, I don't think poverty is a problem here in Oviedo. I don't think the area is being neglected or people live in poverty.
Poverty is a problem in Budapest. Unfortunately, we can see more and more homeless people on the street.
People feel they're living in a poverty environment, mainly because they're not getting what they expected at the beginning of their lives.
Less than 50% of respondents from these cities agreed that poverty was a problem in their city. More than 80% of respondents from these cities agreed that poverty was a problem in their city.
So, what did you think?
Well, it's very clear that Europeans feel differently about poverty from city to city. So poverty could really be a question of personal perspective.
Yes, and I think it's tied to living expenses.
How do you mean?
By living expenses, I mean housing and utility bills, food, transport, education and childcare, among others. Expenses differ widely among EU countries and between rural and urban areas. Look, I have some information on housing expenses to explain it.
On average, 10% of the European population was suffering from housing cost overburden in 2010.
Housing cost overburden? What does that mean?
It means that they spent more than 40% of their income on rent, utility bills and other costs associated with housing. You can see here that such housing costs were a relatively smaller issue for Cypriots than in the rest of the EU, with only 2.5% suffering from housing overburden. Whereas in Denmark, the burden of housing costs was clearly much more widespread than in other countries, with 21.9% of the population suffering. To expand on this, people living in cities tend to be more affected by housing cost overburden than those living in rural areas. But as I said before, housing costs are just one example of basic living expenses. If we add food, transport and education, the perspectives become more and more varied and complex.
Well, I think you may have enough here for a great story.
Yeah, definitely. All of this research confirms that our perception of poverty can really be relative to the society we live in. including aspects like our geographical location and our own perspective. Poverty is measured in relative terms on certain occasions in the EU, and as we've seen here, there's a good reason for it.